Oh yeah, we should record locally too.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Hey guys, sorry, we're
Hello,
we're
hello.
we're still getting our act together.
Uh,
Okay, just tell me when to start.
okay. Let's see. Let me make sure the microphone's on the right setting. Focus. Okay. And I'm recording.
Okay, perfect.
Recording.
All right. Hello, everybody.
Oh my goodness.
How's it
Hey
going?
everybody. Oh my gosh.
So
I
there's
walked.
nothing in true crime to talk about. So
There's
let's
nothing
just
to talk about.
let's talk
This
about
is
our
what
feelings
Can we also talk about how peer pressure works? Because people were
and
so
not the truth.
angry we didn't have a live
I know.
yesterday.
Alice was like,
But
"I'm not having this baby. I'm gonna hold it in." No, I've totally lost Alice. What happened? No, I cannot unmute your guest. You've muted yourself somehow, Alice.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you now.
My microphone cut out, so
Yeah, sure. It was the microphone's fault.
I need to restart my recording. I'm sorry. I'm a mess.
Okay,
I
you
barely
are a mess.
made it tonight.
All
Okay,
right, well, hold on. I'm
I'm
stopping mine
recording.
too.
Crud. Okay, I'm starting over. On your mark, get set,
Oh, wait.
record.
Hold on.
Record.
What in the world?
Is it not recording?
Okay. Is there some weird delay for everybody else?
Is this not working? Can you not hear me?
Oh, wow.
What's happening? Why are you laughing? I
Hold on.
can't figure it out. I'm turning it off while you're laughing at me.
Is it just me? So everybody else, it sounds great. It's just me. Okay.
I don't know what you're laughing. I literally don't know what you're talking about at all. So I'm turning off my camera because I don't know why you're laughing.
Because I can't.
Do you need me to
Okay, hold
call
on.
you separately? Because I literally don't know what's going on.
I'll be right back.
Guys, you can hear me fine, right? I'm not the drunk one, right? Okay, good. See, thank you guys for validating me. It's not, I can hear Brett just fine. He is literally just laughing his mind off because he's been skiing all day long. So it's just the Alice show now. Guys, I ran over here so fast that almost walked the baby out, but the baby's still in for like another day or two. So I'm so excited that you guys are here. We got the verdict like when Brett, I think we were both with our kids. I almost dropped my toddler because I was like, hold on, mom needs to go watch the verdict. And they were like, what's a verdict? I was like, justice is about to be done. Brett, stop laughing. Nobody knows why you're laughing.
Okay, that was the weirdest thing. I'm not sure what happened, but it was like I heard everything you were saying 5 seconds after you said it. And so I left the studio and I came back and now it's fine. So we can continue.
All I have to say is I think everyone's on Alice's side and everyone thinks you're drunk.
Hey, I am not drunk. I'm happy to leave. If nobody wants to hear from me, I'm all, anyways. Okay. What are we talking about tonight, Alice? Are we here to talk about?
We're here to talk about skiing.
The verdict in the Murdoch trial. We'll get us back on track. This will be an episode, by the way, of Legal Briefs. So Alice at some point needs to do
the intro. Okay, here we go.
Why don't you go ahead and do that? Let's go do that. Okay.
All right. All right. Welcome back to the Prosecutor's Legal Briefs. I'm your host, Alice, and I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, the final Bro.
Oh, that's so sad, Al. To leave this behind kind of breaks my heart. It's been such a ride, right?
It has been a saga because you guys, we have been recording like crazy. The Prosecutor's Podcast episode series of the Murdoch case, including the trial. And obviously this is like, I don't know, our 20th live, not really, but it feels like it. And in that time, Brett's drank 20 million gallons of bourbon and I have grown a whole human. And this part is true. Thank you guys for your well wishes. this baby is getting evicted in like days. So baby watch will be over soon, but not before we talk about the verdict.
I know, which was our ongoing joke. We recorded an episode today, as a matter of fact. And the last thing we said was, will we get a verdict or we get a baby first? And how
It
could
was
we
up in the
know?
air. It was up
It
in the
was.
air. I really
It
thought the
was.
baby was going to beat the verdict. And we will talk about all of it today, guys. We will cover closings. We will cover jury misconduct, dismissing jurors, alternates. We will stay here all night because whatever, the baby comes and I'll just take the microphone with me to the hospital. And of course, we will talk about the time of deliberation, if that was fast, if that was what was expected, and of course, the guilty verdict. Guilty on all counts, and even ending with the mandatory remand with Alec in handcuffs, walking away, never with even a glance back to Bus, which was really sad for Bus.
And I've got my massive cup of coffee here. So I am ready to go all night long. Let's do this. And I want to say,
Of
I want to
water.
start on a somber note. You know, not to depress everybody at the very beginning, but I'm curious what people felt when the verdict came down, because I was very nervous as they were getting ready to read it, because I truly believed he was guilty and truly believed the prosecution did a great job. And I was going to be so disappointed if the jury had come back not guilty, which when they come back in 3 hours, they have a verdict. There's not going to be, they obviously weren't hung. So it was going one way or the other. And I was not looking forward to the multiple episodes Alice and I were going to have to do defending the jury system after that, because people were already complaining about the jury system before we even had a verdict. And then the verdict came down, and obviously I was happy about it. But then immediately I was sad. And I think it kind of goes to the limitations of the justice system. All we can do is bring the guilty to justice. But I didn't feel a lot of joy there. You know, 2 people are dead. They're never going to be brought back. It is impossible to imagine the thoughts that went through their heads in those last few moments when their father, there is no doubt in my mind that they loved him. And there's no doubt in my mind that he loved them at some level. For him to do that, and I don't know, it was just sort of this overwhelming sadness kind of hit me. And it was as much as it was a celebration of justice, it was sadness that, this is humanity and this is life.
Yeah, and thank you for starting it out on that note, because obviously people have been very invested in this for 6 weeks of trial and years of investigation, and it's easy to kind of have this elation if you were for team guilty, or incredible sadness. But I think that's true, Brett. There are no winners, unfortunately, in the criminal justice system, because we're only in the criminal justice system because something devastating has happened. We've talked a lot about the family dynasty and how powerful they are, and how that may have a lot to do with the motive of bringing, the legacy that is the family. I take no joy that the Murdaughs have fallen from the highest of places to really the lowest of places. I am so sad for Buster. I am so sad for each of his brothers. I don't care whether they knew or not. I don't care whether they lied or not. An entire, generations of family are ruined. An entire community will never quite recover from this. The Low Country, South Carolina, I mean, if you're from this area, this will define how people view you for a very long time. And so, just remember that these are real lives. These attorneys have given sweat, tears, not just a job. When you do this type of work, defense or prosecution, it is not for a paycheck. You do it with your entire life behind it. There is not a single case that Brett and I have tried that has not taken a piece of who we are and defined who we are, because you care about your work. It is truly doing something of a greater purpose. So whatever you feel about Waters, about Griffin, about Poop Poop, all of those things, remember they are real people, and it has defined their lives as well. And we say all that just to set the stage, and we're going to talk about all of your legal questions, all of your factual questions, but keep that in mind. This is not entertainment for the people who were involved. This is life and the justice system.
And I've never been to a sentencing that I didn't feel bad, that I didn't feel, some amount of I don't know what the right word is. Sorrow for the people who were going to prison and for their family that were left behind. And Alice mentioned mandatory remand. And what that means is, in a lot of cases, when you're convicted, you are automatically remanded to prison. It doesn't always happen. In fact, if you've been out, which he wasn't, but if you've been out on bond throughout the trial, oftentimes you'll stay on bond after the trial. A good example of this is the Theranos case. Elizabeth, whatever her last name is, she's currently out on bond, awaiting final remand to prison. Not a violent crime. She was on bond the whole time. Usually that happens. Automatic remand, though, as soon as you're found guilty, you go to jail. And I had a case once where a lady, it was a nurse actually, and she was stealing medication and selling it to fund her own habit that she had. And she pled guilty. And her lawyer, I guess, had done a poor job of telling her that mandatory remand was what was going to happen. And she pleads guilty. And we go to sentencing, and she wanted to stay out between when she was sentenced and when her daughter had her baby. And she didn't know, like, no, this is automatic. Once the judge accepts your guilty plea and sentences you, you're going to prison. And she just died. She started crying. She was so upset. It was one of those cases. It was kind of tragic on the one hand anyway, because she obviously had an addiction. And the judge looked at me and said, "Do you oppose her staying out?" And I had to say, because of the law, yeah, the law requires her to be remanded automatically. And that felt really bad. And this is a little different because obviously Alec Murdaugh is a monster in many ways. But, I don't know anything about Buster. I don't know anything about his brothers. For all I know, they're all fine, upstanding people. But what I do know is this is absolutely devastating for them and their family. And I think it's worth remembering, even as we are all happy that justice is done in this case.
Absolutely. Okay, so I'm gonna take us back to closing, and then we can talk about the verdict. So, as you guys know, the judge actually asked the attorneys how long they wanted for closing, and they both agreed to 3 hours. 3 hours, relatively, is a pretty long time for a closing. A short trial closing was typically 30 minutes to an hour, and you kind of want to stay in the hour zone because have you ever tried to sit still for 3 hours? It's really hard. You lose people's attention. Because of the length of the trial, 6 weeks, the amount of evidence, 3 hours is probably proper, and each side gets the same amount. Prosecution always goes first because the burden is on the prosecution. And we've talked about this when you guys mentioned how slow it seemed that the evidence took to come in. Doesn't really matter because it just has to come in so that it can be talked about in the closing. And the closing is argument. Remember, opening, you're setting the stage and you're saying what evidence will come in, but it's not supposed to be argument. Closing, all that goes out the window. It is the time for the prosecution to tell you what they think happened based on the evidence that's been admitted. And Creighton Waters gave the whole 3 hour closing. He gets a rebuttal too, but he did the entire closing. And I will say, those of you who haven't seen a lot of real life closings and have only seen Hollywood closings, it was excellent. It really, truly was excellent because you have to balance certain things. You have to balance outrage, passion, storytelling, and teaching, right? He brought the right amount of fire, I thought. He is bringing the indignity of this tragic crime on behalf of the people, on behalf of Paul, on behalf of Maggie, on behalf of their families and all of their loved ones. But you are also holding the fate of a man's life in your hands, and you have to be the appropriate amount of fire, right? This is not the time to come in with a bludgeon because that's not appropriate for the state to do. I thought he did strike the right balance, but he also spoke with such conviction that he knew justice was on his side. And he also, I thought, tied the evidence together in a very compelling way. Clearly this was something he lived and thought about for a long time. I mean, there were turns of phrases that I thought were just poetic that will probably be quoted, for a very long time. The way he humanized the last moments of Maggie and Paul, I think were incredibly effective because no one can testify to what they actually felt. They can testify to the way their heads were turned, the way their brains were blown out of their heads, the way they were running, what may have happened in those last moments, but no one can actually testify to what they felt. And in closing, he could do that. And I thought he gave a really compelling visual of what was happening. And I think one of the things that you'll probably hear over and over is that whether it was true or not, it could fit the evidence. He said the last thing Maggie was thinking was she was running to her baby. I mean, just putting the word baby in there made me cheer up, and I wasn't even ready for that because it humanized the fact, what a lot of you have said. Paul may have been disliked. He may have been driving a boat, probably was really driving a boat that killed Mallory Beach. And he had a lot of faults in life, but he was someone's child. He was someone's baby. No one deserves that type of an end. And I thought that was a beautiful way to weave that in, to truly show you the victims that are in this case.
And I just want to say, look, people get things wrong all the time. We get things wrong all the time. We analyze stuff and we come to the wrong conclusion. The very first episode of Legal Briefs, we talking about Johnny Depp and Amber Heard, and we thought the jury would basically split the baby and nobody get anything. We got that wrong. That happens. But I got to tell you, some of the analysts in this case, I hope you all remember who they were and what they said for the next trial so that they do not lead you astray the way they led many people astray in this case and convinced people that the prosecution was doing a terrible job and there was no evidence and he's probably going to be acquitted. And if he's not acquitted, it's going to be a hung jury. And then 3 hours later, the jury comes back with a conviction. And one of the reasons for that was the excellent closing argument that everybody in the media also said was terrible. And people kept asking us, like, we hear this is really terrible. Is this really terrible or not? And I thought, and I had not seen it because I was skiing when it happened. And so as I'm driving home, my wife and I are listening to this argument so that, we could talk about it on Monday when the jury comes back, not realizing it was going to happen today. And I'm thinking as I start this 2.5 hour thing, because it was about 2.5 hours long, man, everybody's saying how terrible this is going to be. This is going to be really boring on this drive. It was awesome. It was an awesome closing that did everything it was supposed to do. And, it's one thing, this just irritates me. So forgive me when I get on my soapbox. It's one thing for people who are not lawyers, who aren't prosecutors, who aren't defense attorneys, to be surprised by that kind of closing, because we're used to the Hollywood closing that lasts 5 minutes and it's very fiery and beautiful and, all this other stuff. That's not a real closing. And the people who should have known that's not a real closing, that this is a real closing and that this was actually an excellent closing, went on television and acted like it was terrible, because that's the way you get people to watch you. People don't watch you when you say, yeah, you did a great job. They watch you when you're like, oh, that was terrible. I'm really worried about the case. The whole thing's falling apart. What are they doing? Right? The critic is always the one who gets all the clicks. And it just drives me crazy. And it's driven me crazy this entire case. And so, like I said, I hope people paid attention. And when we're talking about the trial in the Idaho case, or we're talking about the trial in the Delphi case, or we're talking about the Lori Vallow case, or whatever the next trial is, remember the people that you can't trust and don't let them get you wrapped around the axle again, because it's just not worth your time, and they're not helping you understand anything.
That's a great point. I had so many friends text me during all of the recesses when the talking heads would come on and basically just attack the prosecution and say all these things like the jurors, they're crying and they're completely on Murdoch's side. And I was like, maybe, I don't know. I'm not in the courtroom, so I can't speak to how the jurors are acting. And it's a fool's errand, by the way, trying to decipher what the jurors are thinking. But they're always going to do that. They're going to attack the prosecution. Even while I was like, are we watching the same trial? Because I think the prosecution is doing a fantastic job. And we'll talk about the speed of the deliberations. You guys are right. Under 4 hours, about 3 hours of deliberation is really fast for 6 weeks. Typically, a rule of thumb doesn't always work. A speedy verdict is typically good for the prosecution because it's a lot harder to acquit with 12 people. And it's also with a hung jury, you typically have 1 or 2 people and there's usually a lot of fighting. And so it gets dragged on. So typically, rule of thumb, if you have a quick verdict, it typically tips in favor of the prosecution. But I'm tipping my hand for the verdict. All that to say is with the amount of text the two of us were getting from people who are like, am I watching the same trial as everybody else? Because you guys are the only ones saying that the prosecution is doing a good job, and everyone is beating up on, the prosecution, that they don't know what they're doing. They knew what they were doing. And this is just the truth. Trials are tedious, and there are rules that are in place to protect your and my due process rights under the Constitution. And thank goodness they exist. I would rather have a 6-week long trial and 6 hours of closing arguments if my life were in the balance, rather than a TikTok video of 30 seconds of some funny dance move to show why I'm guilty. So just know that, our justice system has developed over centuries, and it didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of, justice systems before it. But know that the justice system is tedious. The prosecution walked through all of the steps it needed to. It did not take any short steps. It didn't, the closing for the defense, we'll get to this, really harped on how messy the investigation was. I don't think this was a messy investigation. Could certain things have been done? Sure. There is an unexhaustive list of things that can be done in your life at all times, same as in an investigation. Just because they're not done does not make it a shoddy investigation in and of itself. So I'm really glad that this trial got all the attention that it did, that it was streamed pretty much in its entirety. I think more people watched this trial in its entirety than just like TikTok clips than other cases, for whatever reason. First of all, it was fascinating. But I think by watching the trial and not just watching TikTok clips of it, you begin to understand the depth of the justice system and understand for yourself what is a good case and what is not a good case. So I just want to pat you guys on the back, because most of you in the gallery, at least, were agreeing that the prosecution seemed to be walking through the correct steps.
Yeah. And Marianne said it's not the critic that counts. And I was literally thinking that today, that more of my brethren, because defense attorneys, they always think the person's innocent, and that's fine. They bring a different perspective. We love that perspective. It's one reason we love Bob Motta, who we have a lot of respect for, and is about the only person on television who made any sense. So if you want to follow these things in the future, just listen to Bob Motta. But the prosecutors who are nitpicking every single thing the prosecution did, I kept thinking about that. Like, it is so easy to do. And you can say I would do it differently. There were things the prosecution did that I was like, oh, I don't know about that. The order some of the witnesses came in, some of the time they spent on the financial stuff, I was like, I don't know that I would do that. But the fact that I might do it differently doesn't mean that that's right. And they were the ones who have lived with this case for a year, and they knew how they wanted to present their case, and they presented it exactly the way they wanted to. And they were prepared, and they were ready. And I will tell you, to me, the fact they were prepared, they were organized, they knew how they were going to do it, and they got it done was impressive. And honestly, if you compare that to the closing of the defense, you see where I don't know what was going on with Jim Griffin. He is obviously a good attorney. He's shown that throughout this trial. His closing argument was abysmal. Yeah, I mean,
something
it
happened.
was bad.
It seemed like, when an athlete, an athlete's capabilities, and they have like a mental block, and something happens on the field where you're like, that's not the same athlete that I know is capable of doing other things. Jim Griffin is a good attorney. Something was going on. And that's why I tried to humanize the attorneys in this case at the beginning. We don't know what's going on with them. We don't know who they spoke to. We don't know if they spoke to Buster, if they spoke to their client. They came to certain revelations about themselves. It's really hard not to get personally invested in your cases. This client is not just a client. I mean, truly, they've sat next to him, breathed the same air, eaten with him for months on end. And we don't know what was going on in Jim's head, but the truth is, if you watch the closing, he was disorganized. He lacked any sort of passion one way or the other. I thought I was watching like a breach of contract or an insurance case closing, as opposed to a murder defense closing. You have to also read the jury on what the appropriate amount of emotion is. But there can be just as impassioned of a closing in defense of someone who's been being tried for murder as there is for the prosecution. In fact, those are some of the best closings. The whole who he is and what he's built over his life and how this is not who he is. And there was a lot of umming and ahhing, and like he seemed unsure of himself. He lacked confidence in what he was saying. And again, I don't know what happened. Something happened, I think, in his own life, or his mental block or something. But the closing I thought was incredibly disorganized, ineffective, poorly delivered.
And I don't know if Poot was like, I'm going to do the closing until the last minute and then said, actually, you should do it, Jim. And he just had to do it on the fly. Or, I mean, this is all speculation. The one time Jim was passionate was when he talked about Paul and talked about his friend Paul. And I almost feel like Jim might have been too close to this case. And that maybe at some point he really did kind of realize, you know what? He killed him. He killed him. He killed my friend Paul, which is what he called him in the closing. And even though he was trying to do his job and trying to do a good job, it really was in his head, even if it was subconscious, because there's just no reason for a closing to look like that. You notice the prosecution, they had a theme, and basically he structured his delivery around means, motive, and opportunity, right? Or motive, means, and opportunity. I forget the order he put it in, but he had a structure, and he used that structure to move through the evidence and show how each piece of evidence helped establish those various things, right? Jim had no structure. He had points he made, but there was no organization to it whatsoever. He was just all over the place. One moment he's talking about SLED and how they did all the stuff they shouldn't have done. The next moment he's talking about how he didn't really give an interview to HBO, which was just a weird moment where he's like, and I take offense of that.
It was weird to insert himself when the case was clearly about Murdoch. That's why that something was going on. Like, he's a good enough attorney to know that was completely off base.
Yeah. And like Melissa said, even his phone went off in the middle of it. It was just like, it was just a train wreck. And I'm not just saying that because he's a defense attorney and I disagreed with him. I thought Jim should do it. People asked, why did they ask for 2? Or why did they ask to split it? And I said, the reason is because Harpootlian wants to talk and Jim needs to talk. Jim needs to be the one to do this because he is the more talented attorney, and that's just obvious. I don't know what happened. I'm not sure why it went that way. To answer this question, it is not enough for ineffective counsel. You're never going to get ineffective counsel based on the closing. It just was a poor closing. And I don't know what happened, but it just wasn't good. Just objectively, it wasn't good. And they had good points to make. I think Alec Murdaugh is absolutely guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, but they had some things they could say. And they had already built in this whole SLED investigation was problematic, which it was only problematic to the extent that if SLED had done a better job, they would have found more evidence of Alec Murdaugh. Going into the house, they kept talking about the house. They should have done more with the house. The murderers were never in the house. If they had done a better job processing the house, what they would have found is more evidence that Murdoch did it. So that I always thought was a weak argument, but it was one they were going to make. And it's a standard argument. But even that was so disjointed and all over the place. And I don't know what was going on with him, but something was.
But let's say this. I think Brett and I have both had experiences in court and in our legal careers where we've frozen. So we are human beings, and I have thankfully not frozen in a situation like a closing or something of huge consequence like that, but I have absolutely frozen when I should have been on my game, and it happens. Just like athletes, just like any of you in your lives, it can happen where the words are not coming to you. Maybe he got into a fight with Alec or with Poot backstage, before all this happened, or the enormity of what was happening and he knew the verdict was going to be guilty, hit him really hard right as he was doing it. Who knows? But again, he's a human, and I think he probably had something better planned, and for whatever reason, it flew out the window. And unfortunately, it wasn't like a 10-minute closing. It was like 2 hours, and it was a rough go to walk through all of it. And here's the thing. You also want to be a storyteller in the closing, especially for defense. When you don't have a defense, you tell a story, and that's okay. That is what you do. You tell a story of Paul as a baby and the loving family pictures or what have you of Alec and Paul and how close he and Buster were and how Moselle was like this boy's dream and, to be cut down in the prime of life. in the place that he called home. I mean, whatever. You talk about it as a story. You distract, you humanize, whatever you do. And he didn't do that. And I know he's capable of doing that, but he failed to do that. And I think, the evidence was already so overwhelming. I don't think this only came down to the closing, but I did think that the defense missed points they should have, and the prosecution brought it together. One thing we were really hard on the prosecution about was all of the financial misdeeds, the check after check, and how boring it was. But again, they knew what they were going to do with that. And so they had a plan for it. And I did think it was very effective, that whole line of argument that Waters had of how easily Alec Murdaugh could lie, that it just flowed out of him. It was part of who he was. And he brought it together beautifully. If he hadn't done that, I probably would be a little bit more peeved that he had spent so much time on the financial records things. But he himself knew where the structure was, and he followed that structure, and it worked for him. It might be that when you have too many cooks in the kitchen, like the defense had a lot of different, even their experts fought with each other in a way, through their testimonies. It's possible that when you don't have a clear one head, or maybe you have personalities that are fighting among the defense counsel, that you lose track of who is in charge and kind of what story you're building. And that's what I felt. It felt like a directionless closing for the defense.
And, my wife, who has much more level head than I and doesn't do as much true crime as I do, but loves me and was forced to listen to this entire closing as we were driving down the road, was commenting on how great a story the prosecution told, and how they wove a story that by the time you finished it, you just thought, this guy is so guilty. And just as I listened to the prosecution, I was like, this jury has to see it. They have to see it. It is so obvious as he's doing all this. And the thing about the defense, and I think Alice might have put her finger on it, because Alice is always right. It is very likely that Harpootlian and Jim Griffin had a different vision for what their defense was going to be. And Harpootlian really wanted to rely on Sled messed everything up. The ballistics aren't right. Here's an expert to show that he was shot from the top down instead of, from the bottom up. And Jim wanted to focus more on the emotions that you're talking about. And to me, the only way to win this case, and the only thing that gave anyone pause in this case, was the notion that that man would shoot his son. Most people could buy that, husbands shoot their wives all the time, right? So that was never going to work. Like, they had a loving marriage. Okay. Unfortunately, happens all the time, right? It's a cliche that the husband did it. But the son, and the whole shooting him in the head in this vicious way, this brutal way, this cold-blooded way, people who had reason, they didn't have reasonable doubt, because it wasn't reasonable, but it was doubt, and it was emotional doubt. It's almost more powerful than logical doubt, was that. And that should have been the entire focus of the closing. Like Alice said, the entire focus should have been, you can't tell me that beyond a reasonable doubt that he killed his family based on circumstantial evidence and pings and a video that could have happened 30 minutes before the murder, for all we know. You can't tell me he did this when you see how loving they were, and here they are coaching baseball and all sorts of stuff. I agree with Alice 100%. That should have been the focus. And instead, there was no focus. The closing wasn't a focused attack on Sled, and it wasn't a focused, not attack, but building up of this relationship. His best moments were talking about the relationship, and I think that's the moments he believed in, but the rest of it was a mess. And I think that jury went back, and as we said, best story wins, and it was easy for them. They didn't need 3 hours. There were 3 hours between when they went back there and when they came out. The actual deliberations were probably 45 minutes. Remember, everybody else has to get back to the courtroom. Everybody has to get in place. Like, there was a period of time where the jury had come back, let the judge know, and he's letting everybody else know. So this was a really short deliberation.
Yeah, that's a great point, Brett. And we won't harp on Griffin for much longer, but it did sound like he was handed notes and he had to basically give someone else's presentation, and he didn't want to do that. But maybe the client has say in things, and maybe Alec was like, I want what Poot wants, and may have cursed him out and said, this is what you're doing. And so he gave the best argument except it's not because he didn't believe in it. And a lot of you pointed that out, right? The best story wins. He could have given an alternate story of what happened where it made his client not guilty. But instead of focusing on one story, he did a lot of what ifs that were completely not backed up by evidence whatsoever. He literally was like, I don't know, maybe Paul found a drug dealer. You're like, what? Where did that come from? And I say that not to make fun, but you do want, as the defense, to give an alternate theory, an alternate story to create reasonable doubt. But when you're pulling it literally out of thin air and you haven't explored it through the trial, through your cross-examinations, through your witnesses, you're not technically supposed to do that when it's completely not supported by evidence. The defense gets away with this a lot more than they should. But it fell flat, right? Because the jurors are like, what are you talking about? I've given up my life for 6 weeks. I've sat here, check after check after check, after expert, looking at people with these, gory autopsy photos. And you're trying to come up with a random list of what could have happened. Remember that inexhaustible list of things you can do in an investigation? There's an inexhaustible list of what ifs, aliens, Yetis, what have you. But that didn't ring true to the jury. So if he really believed in that method, he would have spent a lot more time thinking, okay, what is the best alternate theory that fits the evidence we have? And it's almost like right before he was to take the stand or take the stage, he was like, give me some bullet points of alternate theories because we have to give him another story. It was like he hadn't even thought about what the alternate theory was. You don't have to give alternate theories. I think it's a good tactic to do so, but not in the way that he did it.
And, it's such a good point. The prosecution doesn't often get to mock the defense. Usually it's the other way around. Usually the defense is mocking, something the prosecution's trying to spin. And one thing the defense did get to mock, the whole I did them bad or whatever, prosecution, that was a mistake by the prosecution. That was a misstep. Trying to say that in that video, he basically confessed. He did not. And they should have known that. And the defense attacked that in closing. And that was a mistake. But the prosecution got to really go after the defense on the 5'2" killer, which was absurd. And everybody knew it was. Everybody knew it was absurd from the very beginning and railed on them for that. And then Jim, as Alice was saying, walks into it again with this bizarre where he basically is like, well, Paul was the little detective. Maybe he found the drug dealers, and then maybe he confronted the drug dealers and he said, you stay away from my dad or I'm going to tell. And you could see the prosecution was like, what in the world over there? And they finally decided to object, which, normally
that is totally objectionable.
But that was so objectionable, but it was also silly. Like Alice was saying, it undermined everything else he was saying. It was as if he said maybe aliens came down, found the guns, didn't realize what they were, and accidentally shot Paul and Maggie. I mean, it was that absurd. So, yeah, I don't know. Like I said, don't want to spend this whole time attacking the defense closing because they weren't dealt a great hand, but it could have been better. Unfortunately, I was literally finishing up the defense closing when the verdict came down. So I have not yet seen the prosecution's second closing. So I will have to defer to Alice if she's seen it. I have heard it was brilliant.
It was fantastic. It was fantastic. I mean, because Waters was focused, he knew. So in a rebuttal, you're supposed to just respond to the points made by
Meadors. I think his name is Meadors.
Meadors. You're supposed to make the points that were brought up in the closing. You're not supposed to do like a total rehash because the first close, we call them first close and second close. First close is the longer one, right? The first close is you're telling the story. You have to walk through all the legal stuff too. People forget that it's not just storytelling. It's actually very tedious. You have to go through all of the elements, explain the legal side of what the jury must reach in order to convict, and go through all of the evidence that has been presented in 6 weeks and how it fits into all of those buckets within the elements. So it's actually a really tedious job to do first close. The second close is really where the fire is. And second close is really fun when you're the prosecution because it is the end of the trial. You have had the first close, which is the tedious legalese and bringing all of the evidence together. Then the defense goes, and especially if it's good or bad, you have had to listen and you have an outline for what you want your rebuttal to be. But the rebuttal is where it's an art. You are off the cuff and you are responding in real time to what the defense has just said, especially when you have like a 3-hour long closing, that's not an easy thing to do because there's a lot of points you want to make and you don't want to do what the defense has done. You don't want it to be scattershot. That's a bad rebuttal. A bad rebuttal is, let me respond to point 1. This is why they're wrong. This is point 2. This is why they're wrong. You'll see inexperienced attorneys do that because it's easier to do that because you can make bullet points as they're talking and just kind of cross off what the defense got wrong. But that's not effective because this is the last thing the jurors hear before they go deliberate. This is when you go for the jugular and you bring 6 weeks worth of trial together to wrap it up in a beautiful package with a bow that says beyond a reasonable doubt. Like there is no reasonable doubt here. Everything they said, that this is why it's an art, is instead of doing the scatter shot, you're having to weave it into this beautiful tapestry that is the rebuttal. And they did that. Part of it is they've lived this case. They knew generally what the defense's themes were going to be, and they can anticipate some of that. But I thought the way that he seized on really the lost opportunities in the defense's closing were beautiful. And they didn't operate on the rebuttal. They didn't operate on the defense's terms. They brought it right back to what the prosecution's theory was, which I thought was beautiful, and the story that they told. And there was continuity from first close to second close in a way that it kind of squeezed out the defense's close. It was like the defense didn't even talk by the end of the rebuttal. I couldn't remember what they said because they drew so much back in of the first close that it weaved this beautiful story that I can only imagine as the jury went out to deliberate. The prosecution had done such a good job of telling them this tight-knit story that fit the facts that they got to see, smell, and taste themselves. Remember, they took a trip to Moselle, right? That they could tangibly feel everything the prosecution was saying before they went back. And that was like, it was artful.
Well, I didn't get to see it. Sorry, I was having to unmute myself. I didn't get to see it, but I'm going to watch it because I've heard people say that. You know, the last trial Alice and I had before she left, Alice did the rebuttal closing, and you can tell how passionate she is about it. We won that case, and it was all because of Alice.
It was,
but
also no one got murdered.
I mean, the thing is, really, all the facts and the evidence should be out by that first closing. As Alice said, the first closing, you know, you're giving them the law, you're making some points about circumstantial evidence of what it is. You know, people were so excited that he used the rain analogy, which we've used before. We did not make that up. That is a classic. That is a classic how to explain circumstantial evidence. But yeah, I mean, it can be a little bit more tedious. That last closing is when you can bring the hammer. And the last thing the jury hears, well, the last thing they hear is the jury charge. But the last thing they hear from you, it has to be where you really do bring it all together. And you charge the jury with, you have heard the evidence, whatever your misgivings about finding someone guilty, because that's an important thing. You know, Harpootlian in his opening said to the jury, I want you to do a hard thing. I want you to set aside the fact this man has been arrested and consider him innocent. And he's right. That is a hard thing for anyone to do. We all think somebody gets arrested, they got him, it's over, right? And that is a hard thing to do. Equally hard, though, is to make that final decision. Yes, this man killed his wife and child, and he needs to go to prison for the rest of his life because of it. That's hard too. And you, in that rebuttal closing, you have to get that jury to where they're willing to accept the evidence. You've already given them all the evidence. Now you have to get them to accept it and not ignore it and not be nullified, you know? And I haven't seen it, but from what everyone has said about it, it sounds like that's exactly what he did. And so I'm looking forward to watching it later on.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And the judge makes a beautiful speech at the end of the verdict where he thanks the jurors. And this is exactly right. You know, I had the opportunity to clerk for a judge who, at the district court level, who really had these beautiful speeches that were heartfelt when he charged the jury before deliberation and also after they reached a verdict, that really hit the heart of their constitutional duty. And to recognize the beauty, though imperfect, system that we've built in this country and how important each of them are. Those 6 weeks were 6 weeks of their lives. Everyone has families and obligations and jobs. I think one of the jurors, you know, like almost lost his job because he had to be on the jury for so long. You're not getting paid very much. You get a stipend. It barely covers, your gas, at the very least. You don't get to talk to anyone. And also, there's incredible vicarious trauma in a case like this, where you are charged with justice for a person who's sitting across from you, within feet of you, every single day, and also people who are dead, who can't speak for themselves. And it is a very, very heavy burden, and it's very important. And I think it's beautiful. Like, as much as I, rag on the jury sometimes, I think the jury system is absolutely beautiful. It's unique, the way we use it in our justice system. And I can't think of a better way to go about it in our justice system as well.
Yeah, I agree with Alice on that. We talked about this before, and I see people, even before the verdict came out, people were saying, should we have a different system where, highly educated people are on the jury, or where the judges decide? And I just want to remind people, and I don't want to preach about this, but when you say that, you're saying, I don't trust myself with upholding our system, and I'd rather turn it over to nameless elites or people with fancy degrees or whatever. And to me, no, I want ordinary people making that decision. That is, to me, one of the most important parts of our system, and I'm glad we have it. The other thing that's important is having good judges, and a lot of you have commented on this, but the judge in this case, I think he saw a judge who was incredibly patient. He allowed both sides to make their arguments. He allowed the defense on occasion, I thought, to kind of overstep on a few things, but he let them do it, and he was very thoughtful. He explained his decisions in detail. He cited to a lot of case law when he did it. And when you're a defense attorney, you hate that because what you want is a hot-headed judge who goes off, who doesn't cite to anything, who really barely even lets you make objections, and certainly doesn't explain why he's ruling the way he is, because then on your appeal, you get to point to all these things and how you shouldn't listen to what the judge said, because clearly he didn't put any thought into this. We call it papering the record sometimes. Really good judges paper the record. They explain their reasoning in detail, and it makes it very hard. And you see that on both sides. As prosecutors, we will occasionally have judges go against us. And the worst thing when a judge goes against you is then he writes like a 20-page opinion about why. Because you're like, oh, well, there's no way we're going to win now, right? So he did a great job both in controlling the trial, allowing it to go as long as it needed to go, and it was a long trial, but also respecting both sides, but giving reasons for his rulings. And occasionally, he wasn't going to allow that roadside stuff to come in. And the defense kind of stepped in it on that. And I think there will be an appeal in this case, obviously. It won't be a frivolous appeal because there are real issues, real interesting issues. I think Bob called them like real lawyer issues in one of our things we did with him, like the 404B stuff. That's really interesting stuff. And there is an argument to be made that the judge was wrong. I don't think they're going to be able to reach that burden. It's a heavy burden to overturn a trial, but it's a real issue. I think at the end of the day, this conviction will be upheld. And, it'll be interesting to see what Alec Murdaugh does with all his other charges, because presumably, I think he already has some state charges. Presumably federal charges will follow as well. Once he testified, I think he basically had decided, I'm pleading guilty to those cases, because he was giving it all up in an effort to win this case. So, this is going to be one of those things where by the time an appeal is decided, he probably will have already pled guilty to all that stuff. He's going to spend the rest of his life in prison.
And I want to say something that I see a lot in the comments. So when the jury came back, they obviously came back with a guilty verdict. They were individually polled. That's pretty typical, and it can be requested by either side. The defense typically is going to make every juror say their vote, just to make sure no one's bullied into voting a certain way or whatnot. They were all polled. You could hear their voices. There was no hesitation. Sometimes I've been in jury polls where there's like hesitation, or clearly someone starts crying and it was a difficult decision. But here it was like, yes, 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 yes. And that goes along with how short the deliberations were. But a lot of you guys are asking a question. You're saying, well, the judge seemed very good, but then I can't believe he said that he thought the evidence was overwhelming in favor of guilt. That is fine for him to say, because the verdict has been reached. Once the verdict has been reached by the jury, it's all done. The jury can talk to whoever they want. They can write books. They can go on CNN tonight. They can do whatever they want. They can talk, till the cows come home, because their duty is over. And the judge can comment on the weight of the evidence, because here's the thing. They're sentencing tomorrow, but there's also going to, before the appeal, there's probably going to be motions for reconsideration of directed verdict, all these motions for reconsideration before this particular district judge, before it's even appealed to the next court. And in that motion for reconsideration opinion, he's going to talk about all the evidence that came in and how the jury got it right. And he is absolutely allowed to say that. That does not disqualify him. He's not showing bias. He is simply stating for the record, just like he makes rulings when there are objections, his reasoning for how he gets there. So don't be thrown off. I think there are talking heads out there who are like, oh, he's completely disqualified or biased, or he knew all along that he was going to influence the jurors to vote guilty because he thought the evidence was overwhelming. Not at all. I've heard judges say that in almost all of my cases at the end of a verdict. That is not uncommon. It was not improper. And once the verdict is reached, doesn't matter, because the case is over.
So I just want to answer Brenda's question about the death penalty. Look, this could have been a death penalty case. Maybe it should have been a death penalty case. The Attorney General of the state, who you may have seen, Alan Wilson, who you may have seen cross-examining, or not cross-examining, he actually directed the very last witness for the state, which was when you knew the state thought they were going to win. Because the only way Alan Wilson was going to appear in this case is if he felt pretty sure they were going to win. He made that decision. The decision goes to him about whether or not to pursue the death penalty. The reasons that I have seen are that had they done that, death penalty cases are automatically more complicated. They're more complicated in jury selection. They're more complicated in the penalty phase. That had they done that, it would have delayed the trial. That the defense was already saying they were going to need a lot more time if this was a death penalty case. And so the state decided not to pursue the death penalty. If you are cynical and you think, yeah, right, that's the real reason. We all know the real reason is this is Alec Murdaugh. And even if they're willing to prosecute him, they weren't willing to seek the death penalty for him. You might be right. I'm not saying you're not. But the reasons they gave were not bad reasons. And that's why this wasn't a death penalty case.
Yeah, I totally buy those reasons. It might just be that getting a death qualified jury is a lot more, people have a lot more visceral reactions that may or may not be rooted in reason. And by reason, I mean, like, it could just be a reaction. Like, I can't ever be part of something that sentences someone to death. And that's okay. That's your prerogative. But that is a type of question that people have visceral responses to. And it doesn't really fall on either like political line, religious lines. Like, it could be all over the place for different people. And so you get into a lot more of a kind of sticky situation with death penalty types of cases. But also remember, death penalty cases are one of the most expensive types of cases, because you have all of the appeals and they go on for decades and decades and decades. And it's incredibly taxing, quite literally, money-wise, for the taxpayers, for the Attorney General's office, for every level of court, throughout the state court, throughout the federal system, all the way up to the Supreme Court. And it's an exhausting process, and it's an expensive process, and it's a time-consuming process that oftentimes the way that the death penalty works in our system, it doesn't create a lot of finality. And one way to create finality is, like, he has a sentence, he finishes his appeals, his motions for reconsideration, his appeals, done, he's in prison for life. That would bring more finality to the area also than, say, a death penalty case, which we would see Supreme Court appeals to 20 years from now, at the least.
Yeah, and it's kind of appropriate for this guy because prison's going to be rough for him. There's some people who like to be in prison because it's actually easier than their real lives. You see that sometimes. It's not going to be that way for this guy. He is used to a very different standard of living that he's going to experience for whatever time he has left. So I don't know. Ordinarily, in a case like this, I would think the death penalty would be appropriate, but I think this kind of worked out perfectly. Somebody asked about why they asked for a directed verdict. That is standard. It pretty much would be ineffective assistance if you didn't. So you always ask for a directed verdict. And what you got was a judge saying, there is overwhelming evidence. He said this to the defense too. There's overwhelming evidence he's guilty. denied, and they'll file a formal one later on, like Alice said. That may or may not be a part of their appeal, but you can't appeal it if you don't ask for it. Standard, you ask for it, it gets denied. So that's sort of where they are procedurally. The appeal will follow. It'll be decided in a year and a half or so, and by the first level appellate court. Then it'll go to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court of South Carolina probably won't even take the case. Then you make a last-ditch appeal to the Supreme Court of the United States, who definitely won't take the case. And then you start your habeas process. You have to go through state habeas, and then after state habeas, you go through federal habeas, and then once you get through federal habeas, that's it. You're pretty much done, unless the little people killers show up and say we did it, and then you say, oh, there's new evidence, we need to reopen this. Pretty much after that habeas appeal is over, that's it. He'll be in jail for the rest of his life, and we'll never hear about Alec Murdaugh again.
Yep. So that was a roller coaster of emotions. This whole 6 weeks has been a roller coaster of emotions. So I hope that shed some light on what's happened in the last couple of days, from closing arguments to a very relatively fast verdict. Oh, we didn't talk about sentencing. So the end of the verdict, sentencing is coming up. It's a little bit different in each jurisdiction. In this jurisdiction, I guess the judge could have taken it up right away. Typically, in like federal cases, there's some amount of time between the conviction and the sentencing, because there's like a interview process where basically the probation officers will interview and have a recommendation for the judge on where the person falls on the sentencing guidelines and mitigating factors and those sorts of things. But here they are going to come back tomorrow at 9:30 a.m. to begin sentencing. And if you were listening to the judge, he dismissed the jurors because they have finished their duty. So they are now free to go. They are no longer under subpoena power. And they can come back tomorrow if they want it. They wouldn't come back as jurors. They would come back as members of the public to see through the 6-week jury that they've just taken part in. But there will be argument tomorrow as to the proper sentence. And the judge, I think, will impose the sentence tomorrow. Again, it differs from court to court, but based on what he said today, I think it'll probably be, he'll let the parties argue as long as they want. The defense is going to come with all the mitigating evidence, that they can't argue about the guilt part because that's been decided. They're going to argue that he's no danger to anybody, that, he's never had proclivities of running away or trying to flee the country, or he can still be a productive member of society. If you let him on work release, he can do pro bono legal work for the rest of his life, and he can be this contributing member of society instead of sitting in a jail cell costing the taxpayers dollars, trying to basically make an argument that Alex should not spend the rest of his life in jail. And the prosecution is probably, they're going to say that he should spend life in prison, that this was one of the most brutal cases they've ever seen. The jury came back in under 4 hours, and he has been found guilty. This is what the proper guidelines are, and he should absolutely get the maximum, because doesn't matter what your name is, who you are. If you are privileged or not privileged, you should be treated the same under the law, and anyone else who would have been convicted of these crimes would spend the rest of their life in jail. So that's what I predict the arguments to be, and then the judge will rule.
And I'll say a few things, both in response to that and in response to the chat. Number one, I'll go ahead and make a prediction. He's going to get 2 life sentences. That's what's going to happen, in my view. I don't think there's any question about it. Life is what is the sentence he will get. Second thing, somebody asked about his appeals. Your direct appeal, you have a right to, and you have a right to counsel. It's just like trial. So if he can't afford counsel, it will be appointed for him. I would be surprised if at this point Poot and Jim stay on this case. I think probably he's going to say, look, I'm basically indigent at this point. He'll get a lawyer. That person will do it for him. Post-conviction relief, habeas petitions, that's after your appeal. That's where you argue things like ineffective assistance of counsel. You are not guaranteed a lawyer by the Constitution for those appeals. So those appeals are usually done by the defendant himself, unless he can find someone to represent him. Someone said Alec Murdaugh could not do legal work because he's been disbarred. There are prison lawyers. If you're in prison, there are people who, even though they may not even be lawyers, who will often assist other inmates in researching the law, drafting the law. There are legal clinics in prison. Things are different in prison. If Alec Murdaugh ends up in a prison where he can do these kind of things, he will run the legal clinic if he wants to.
He's
And
going
will
to
help
run
him
the
do that.
prison, let's be honest.
He
Like
probably will.
he just is. I mean, we've seen these kinds of people who are larger than life outside of prison. Doesn't
He
really
is
change
not
when you're in
indigent.
prison.
There is money
Oh.
somewhere.
Oh yeah.
And unfortunately, those of y'all who think he's going to go to prison and be whatever, I think in reality, that money is going to make its way into the prison, and he's going to end up being in a good place. Is what I think is going to happen. I don't look. There is more to this story. I don't know what it is, but this story is deeper than this. He was not spending $50,000 a week on pills. That money was going somewhere else. He killed his wife and child. I have no doubt about that. But there is more to this story. And I don't know if we're ever going to know exactly what happened.
So here's my prediction of what he's going to do in prison. Nothing bars you from making money. I think he's going to write books. He's going to be subject to documentaries. He loves himself, right? We know that he's a narcissist. I think he's going to get, I think he's going to wait till all the appeals and there is like absolutely no hope of him ever leaving prison. And then he's just going to like make Netflix documentary after Netflix documentary, write books, give interviews. And remember, though he may file for bankruptcy, if he hasn't already, he probably will. He has family. They can give him all the money that he wants, and he probably will get lots of money. He will be fine. He is not going to be poor in prison. He has lots of family. He has lots of family money. He has Buster, who has stood by him throughout all of this so far, which is a whole devastating story in and of itself. But nothing keeps him from getting money from family members and to basically live a pretty posh life, as posh as he'd like, in prison. And he can talk to anyone he wants on the outside as well. He can't necessarily come out and see them, but he can talk to movie makers. He can talk to authors. I bet you there's going to be a lot of Alec Murdaugh swag coming out soon where he benefits from it.
And don't forget, within at least, 5 years, we're going to have a podcast on this, arguing that he's innocent. That's going to it's going to be it's going to be funny because Netflix currently has the he's guilty one. In 5 years, they're going to have the very glossy, fancy documentary that's going to be all about SLED missed the evidence of the two gunmen on the grassy knoll, right? And then people are going to be like, I don't know, maybe he is innocent. And then we're going to have to do an episode, Alec Murdaugh is guilty, and go back through all the evidence to point it out. Those of you who don't think you can profit from your crimes, most of those statutes are actually unconstitutional. They have to be very narrowly tailored in order to work, and they don't work ever because basically you just farm out your stuff, right? I mean, you find somebody who wants to do a book and you get money from them. The good thing about him is I can imagine he'll have a lot of civil judgments against him. So hopefully what will happen is when he writes the if I did it, here's how book, that money will just go to all the people that he's defrauded over the years. And one other thing about money, this man knows where a lot of bodies are buried. There are a lot of people in South Carolina who are very worried that Alec Murdaugh is going to start talking about all the things he knows. He's going to be taken care of.
Or he's going to be killed. But another story for another day. Let me address something, by the way, that is all over the talking head. Some of you are chatting about it here. The jury did not buy the story that a hitman did it or that there was a second shooter. He was charged with and convicted of being the murderer, of pulling the trigger and being the one who killed Maggie and Paul. So that is the verdict of the jury. That's what the case is around. So these people who are on TV saying like, well, I guess, he's guilty because he had something to do with the deaths, but he still hired someone else to do it, just like he hired someone to shoot him on the roadside. That's not what he was charged with. And that's not what the jury found him guilty of. So they can say that they're wrong on TV when they say that, but that is not what he's charged with. There is a different statute for hiring a hitman and being like an accessory or what have you, aiding and abetting a murder. That is not what's here. He has been convicted of being the trigger puller for Maggie and Paul. So I just want to put a pin in that because I've seen a lot of people talking about it.
And let me just say this. I love Bob. Bob's crazy. There were no hitmen. Okay. I get
Bob's
it.
here, I think.
I know. I'm responding to his last tweet or his last chat. The thing about it is Did SLED do a perfect investigation? No, they never do, which is why smart defense attorneys like Bob, are always focused on all the things they could have done and they didn't do. They should have worn booties and they should have had fewer people in the crime scene and all this other stuff. They did not do a bad enough job to destroy all evidence of the second shooter on top of the pen or wherever this person was, the 5'2" guy running through the swamp with no dogs barking, no guard birds quacking, or whatever the guard birds would do. Even Alec Murdaugh, when he was on the stand, said the reason the dogs didn't bark was because there was nobody else there. It's like, well, thanks, Alec, for pointing that out, that there was no one else there. So the second shooter thing, the only evidence of that is there were two guns. And I think the jury realized, as the prosecution pointed out, he's smart enough to use two guns for the very purpose of now making this argument. And they didn't buy it. And I'm glad they didn't buy it. But Alice is right. This jury believed that he did this, and he did this alone. And I think he did. Now, the roadside shooting thing, I'll never know exactly what he was doing there. Cousin Eddie he's told a bunch of different stories. People keep asking why they didn't put him on the stand, because who knows what he would say, right? He's a complete loose cannon. I don't know why the defense put some of the people they put on the stand. If the prosecution had put Eddie on the stand, that would have been malpractice. Was he actually trying to kill himself? I have multiple theories now about this case. One of them is that he was, that basically, I don't want to give it away because we have 9 more episodes to go or whatever.
So many episodes to go.
But there's a possibility that he really did at that point. He had killed Maggie and Paul to try and save himself from his financial ruin. Financial ruin was coming anyway. He might as well kill himself. Some of you have asked if he's on suicide watch. I hope he is, because I think there's a real danger there. Was he actually trying to die? It would have been very convenient if he weren't. The problem is, I don't know how you fake shoot someone in the head so that it's enough to do some damage, but not enough to kill them. Obviously, it did very little damage, but I'm trying to, I guess you say, put the gun on top of my head and pull the trigger. I don't know.
Can I put another theory on that, though?
Of course.
Clearly, Cousin Eddie knew Alec. And even if your friend, who you know very well, says, no, I want you to kill me and I will give you money to do it, I don't know if I'm able to actually do it, even if, Brett, you are like, I want you to shoot me in the head. I'm not sure, because I know you so well and I don't want you to die, if I could successfully shoot you in the head. So I don't know that Alec was that conniving and that good at being like, just graze my head. It's very possible that Cousin Eddie was just like, I tried, but I really sucked at killing you. I think that's more likely, to be honest, because it is hard to pull the trigger at someone's head when you don't want to kill them.
And Maggie makes a really good point, and a couple of you have said this as well. It's possible this was just to frame Cousin Eddie, that he was going to somehow kill Eddie, and there was a struggle for the gun, which is basically Eddie's latest statement, and he's told 4 or 5, is that there was this kind of struggle for the gun, and it went off. And he thought Alec was dead, and so he ran. And maybe he did intend to kill Eddie and then say, he did it. He was my drug dealer. I owed him a bunch of money. He said, if you don't pay me, I'm going to kill your family. I didn't have the money. I was trying to get it. The story sort of works itself out, right? I was trying to get the money, but I couldn't get the money. And then he killed them, and he was going to kill me, but I was able to get the gun from him and kill him instead. That's not a terrible story. It's a better story than the one they had.
Yeah, Cousin Eddie is just too all over the place for us to really know there. And the question here is, I think the prosecution did a really beautiful job of painting the picture of how Alec could do this, but we don't know what made him ultimately pull the trigger on Maggie and Paul. I think based on the evidence, this was not heat of the moment whatsoever. He had planned to do this, even if he had just planned to do it that day. I think it probably all came together that day. But the fact that his phone went dead an hour before the murders shows, in my mind, his premeditation. He knew exactly what was going to happen. He just needed the right time to come along. And that kind of premeditation, that kind of malice, I still am not in a place mentally where I can imagine that is possible for a father to do. But he did do. You'll just have to listen to like 12 episodes of the Murdaugh series on the Prosecutors podcast to find out what we think the motive is. Because I'm still not totally sure.
We haven't recorded the final episode yet, so who knows how long it's going to go.
Gosh.
I do want to mention Addie asked about the grand jury testimony and whether or not they lied about the blood on the shirt. This actually goes into your strategy when you're prosecution. And I'm not exactly sure why they put the lead agent in front of the grand jury. Some might say that's a mistake. Alice and I have had big cases where there are a lot of facts, and it's a long grand jury process, and you're asking all these questions, and it's one of those things where the agent is testifying, and sometimes they mess things up. And if you notice they mess something up, you go back and you try and fix it. Are you sure about that? But it's going to happen. And oftentimes you'll put an agent in grand jury that you do not intend to take the stand in the trial. And the reason for that is if that agent testifies in front of the grand jury and then they testify at trial, exactly what you saw happen in this trial can happen. The defense can use their testimony against them. They can take that grand jury testimony and say, well, didn't you say in grand jury there was blood on the shirt? And the guy has to own it. And then later on, they get to do what they did in closing. Argue, he lied to the grand jury about that. He was in there for 3 days and he said this thing that was wrong. He must be a liar, right? And then people believe it and you have to run with it. In reality, he probably just messed it up, or he didn't have all the facts and the prosecution team didn't notice it and they didn't fix it. And so later on, the defense got to use it. But that's what you see happen. And really, it's like a lot of things you see defense attorneys do, including the whole crime scene is compromised thing. It's a standard tactic. And the whole point is to try and show this, this group of investigators, they had it out for my client and they were lying to the grand jury and they're lying to you now. And that's what you saw in this case.
Yeah, I think that's right. Whew, we covered that faster actually than I thought we were going to.
I still got coffee. I can go as long as people want to go. I mean, I feel like we've answered all the questions, but maybe people have even more questions to go.
This probably really is the last live mostly because we need to record our episodes so that we have like some buffer after baby comes.
Max, he wasn't indicted by the grand jury because of blood on his shirt. He was indicted by the grand jury because his voice is on a tape 5 minutes before the murder. And remember, grand jury, all you need is a preponderance of the evidence. He was always going to be indicted.
As low as it gets. Yeah.
Come on.
The amount of evidence, and that's why it's kind of a red herring argument out there. The grand jury doesn't have to explain why they indicted, but it's preponderance of the evidence. And there was certainly preponderance of the evidence at that stage in the investigation, certainly to be able to indict him.
Yeah. Remember, you do it at trial. You wouldn't do it in grand jury. You don't have to lie in grand jury. I mean, come on.
You can indict a ham sandwich, with the grand jury. Okay. Oh, jury misconduct. That's right. Okay. Thanks for reminding me, Bonnie. Okay. So there were a number of alternates in this case. I think a total of 6 jury alternates. That's pretty typical. With such a long jury trial, you want a lot of alternates because, as we saw, people get sick, emergencies arise, whatever. People got COVID in this instance. But of course, the one that made the most news was it today or yesterday? Today. It's been a long day. They were down to just 2 alternates. And then by the end of the trial, they were left with just 1 alternate. So thank goodness there was even someone left over. But a juror was found out to have been talking to 3 other people. You're not supposed to talk to anybody, not your family members, not your fellow jurors, about the case at all before deliberation. And it came out that she was talking about what she thought of the evidence to 3 different people. And the judge found it, investigated it, found that there had been jury misconduct. Judge Newman was he really kept his cool during all of it because people don't mean to do this. It's just really hard not to talk about it. Jury misconduct absolutely happens. Everyone is supposed to report it. As attorneys, if you notice it, like you go to the bathroom, you hear something, you see someone do something, ethically, you have to report it, whether you think it's going to help your case or not. We've done it before. We have seen jurors talk in the hallways or in the bathrooms, and we have to report it to the judge. We tell the other side as well. Fellow jurors are supposed to let the court security officer know if they hear any sort of misconduct, because sometimes people brag about it. They'll be like, oh, when I was on Facebook last night looking at all the articles about this case, people say, like, you're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to report each other. They're instructed to report it because you want the integrity of the case to be intact. And Judge Newman handled it correctly, didn't try to embarrass her, and dismissed her, which you are supposed to do. That's proper because she's been compromised. It doesn't matter if what she said had nothing, had no bearing on ultimately the verdict of the case. It doesn't matter. Everyone is under the same rules. You cannot talk about the case before deliberation. And of course, she asked for her dozen eggs. What? I don't know. But she couldn't, the whole point is she couldn't go back to the jury room because she was going to have no more contact with any of the jurors, and she was to be escorted directly out of the courtroom, which again is pretty typical. And so she asked for her personal belongings, which involved a dozen eggs, which in this economy costs a lot of money. So,
I don't know why she brought the eggs, but asking for the eggs was the most reasonable thing she did because those things are worth their weight in gold. So I totally get why she wanted the eggs back. I don't know what she was planning on doing with the eggs.
Like, were they hard boiled? Were they raw? Were they dyed eggs for Easter?
I don't think they got a frying pan back there, so they had to have been cooked. Or maybe, maybe she has chickens and they were fresh eggs and she was going to give them as gifts to the jurors.
Maybe she was.
Those of you who served on a jury know how tight people get. Because as Alice said, you can't talk about the trial. So when you're eating lunch and all this other stuff, and there's always people in the room with you, so you can't talk about the trial. You have to talk about something. And they often become very good friends. They'll have reunions. One time, Alice and I had a case, and we knew the jury was going to come back the next day because at the end of the day, they asked the judge if this time, rather than having their lunch in the jury room, they could all go out together for lunch. And we're like, well, there you go. They're going to have a verdict tomorrow after lunch. And, it's just funny how these juries become tight.
So I had a jury who, it was a long patent trial, like they tend to be very dry. It's a civil case, patent trial. And I think it was like a 6 or 8 week case. And the jurors on the last day, they had all made shirts matching. And they like, where you like iron on letters. And it said all rise because the judge always says all rise when the jurors are coming in. And so they all got shirts matching that said all rise, which was like very cute. And also like a lot of effort. But that kind of shows you how tight-knit your fellow jurors become throughout it. And so, yeah, anyways, it must have been embarrassing for her. I mean, I'm sure it was. I'm sure we'll hear more about it. She'll probably talk to the media. The fellow jurors will probably talk about it. But all that to say is the judge handled it in the correct way. There's some level of investigation, asking questions, trying to figure out if the allegations are indeed true. There's no standard for this, but the judge is always going to err on the side of being conservative rather than giving the benefit of the doubt because you have you have the verdict on the line. You don't want this trial to have reached the end, to have a verdict, and then to be overturned based on jury misconduct. I mean, that is a complete waste of resources, especially when you have alternates for this very reason. And so if the judge thinks it's more likely than not that she engaged in that misconduct, he needs to get rid of her. And he did. And exactly what happened is an alternate stepped in and the alternate got to deliberate with the jury.
And in the future, Alec Murdaugh, innocent podcast, she will appear in that podcast and say that she knew he was innocent the whole time. And there will be a whole conspiracy theory about how she was removed from the jury because she was going to be the one that was going to hold it up. I mean, look, you see it in every one of these cases. It will happen. It will happen. Someone is planning it even as we speak. They got to give it enough time so that people forget that they really thought he was guilty. But it will come, and she will appear in it, and I'll watch it because hey, we're all suckers.
Exactly. Someone asked, you can't talk about the case. Can you talk about the lawyers? It's a fine line. You're not supposed to talk about the case. It's probably going to be hard to talk about the lawyers without talking about the case. But I will give you an example where I know for a fact the jurors talked about the lawyers. And the lawyer they talked about was me. Because much like right now, I was like 41 weeks pregnant in trial. And apparently I heard after the fact, the jurors were like taking polls every single day on when I would drop my baby during trial, which they were not wrong.
Not unlike this case.
Not unlike this case, except I had the baby before the verdict in that case. So I won in that one. I lost in this one. So yes, you can technically talk about the lawyers, but it's a fine line because it's very hard to talk about lawyers typically without bleeding into the way they presented, right? It'd be hard to say like, man, Griffin's closing, well, closing doesn't matter because you're about to go back, but like Poot really got heated during the way I hate the way he just attacks people. Attacks who? The witnesses? Very pretty close to the case. So if you're on a jury, just talk about your chickens and talk about your kids and talk about the weather. Don't talk about the lawyers or the judge or the case, and you'll be good.
And let me just say, maybe she was staunchly not guilty. I've seen the same reports. Those same reports said things like the entire jury felt that way, and guess what? They didn't. So I am just not trusting the reports or the word on the street. There were so many people who kept saying, it seems like the jury is really disinterested and they're not buying what the prosecution said and they all think he's innocent. And it was all BS. It was just rumor stated as fact, which we've seen throughout this case. And at the end of the day, guess what? You don't deliberate for less than 3 hours if you have any question. They walked in that room and they said, guilty, right? And they're like, yep, guilty. And they were like, well, I guess, let's fill out the sheet. Let's give it a few minutes because we can't just go right back. Let's everybody have a Coke.
Break.
Let's talk about the basketball game last night or something, right? And then they went back. There was no real deliberation here.
No,
they were all convinced when they walked in that they were guilty. There was no wavering person. I mean, a lot of times the reason deliberation takes a long time is because that first, and they don't have to vote. I mean, they run it however they want to. They do it however they want to. But a lot of times juries, it's the first time they can talk about it. And so they'll say, okay, maybe they do it secretly. Maybe it's like, who thinks he's guilty? 10 people raise their hands. One person says, I don't know. And one person says, I think he's not guilty. And the deliberation really becomes the 10 people becoming lawyers and going through the evidence and pointing out the evidence and answering the questions of the wavering person. It's a really interesting group dynamic. And that didn't happen here. They all knew he was guilty going in.
Yeah, and here's the thing. So you heard the verdict. There's a 4-person. That's actually the very first thing you do when you go back to the jury room is you vote on the 4-person.
Not in this case.
Oh, they already had the 4-person, right?
Yeah, South Carolina has some wacky rule where the judge appoints, which
weird, I forgot about that. Okay, well, usually you vote for it, but
so they didn't even have to do that.
They don't have to do that. They probably walked in and they probably were friends at this point, and they either took a secret vote or I bet you someone walked into the room as soon as the door closed and was like, guilty. I really think that happened because they probably, they had 6 weeks worth of pent up opinion where they would want to go through it. But, we've had a lot of juries where you'll have someone on the jury who's like, I absolutely think he's guilty, but to do my civic duty, I want to walk through all the evidence. All the PowerPoints, look through. I want to thumb through all of the pages, make sure that what the evidence they sent me back with is really the evidence, because I still want to make sure if I'm going to send this guy to jail that I get it right. And they're welcome to do that. I think they probably didn't do that in this case because it was such a short amount of time. But that can happen. And that happened in our last trial. I think someone wanted to just go through every mind-numbing page, and they're welcome to. Another note, the jury can ask questions. They have to write them down, though. They can't speak the questions and they can't talk directly to the attorneys, but they can ask questions and pass notes to the judge. And this typically happens when you have one holdout juror, or there's some confusion. Usually there's going to be some fighting happening and the questions are phrased in a way to have the judge bring some order into the deliberation room. That didn't happen here, which makes me think again that everyone was pretty aligned in how they were going to vote right away. There wasn't any having to convince anyone to, vote guilty, which again, I think they got it right. And the media had it totally wrong. Every news outlet, I think, was just like, it's over. It's going to be a hung jury. I said it just because I saw it on the news. I didn't think it should be a hung jury. I thought it should be absolutely guilty. But be careful what you see in the media. Again, people are going to click on those articles because the evidence is so overwhelming.
Man, and let me say this, and I hope all y'all know this, but the one thing I'll say about Alice and me you may not like what we say and you may disagree with it and you may think we're absolute idiots. That may happen, but we will never lie to you and we will never tell you something just because it's the popular thing. And the reason that we said from the very beginning the prosecution was doing a great job and he was going to be found guilty is because that's what we truly believed. And, I'm not patting ourselves on the back, but it happened. And it didn't just happen, it happened in no time at all. And I don't know. As I said at the very beginning, I'll just go back to what I started with. Be careful who you listen to because, a lot of people, they're not in it. They're not in it for truth. They're just, they're playing a role. A lot of these shows, you want one person to say the prosecution is doing a terrible job. You want one person to say the defense is doing a terrible job. Just, it's all so contrived these days. I don't
Well,
even know how to tell you what to listen to.
we're like the worst business people ever, as you can probably tell, because we say exactly what's on our mind and we don't do it to get clicks or anything, right? Like we always say this, we're the cold water prosecutors because we pour cold water on kind of the BS that's out there because we think you're smarter than that. We don't have to say outrageous things just for you, except for radioactive yetis, but we don't have to say outrageous things for you to listen. And that's kind of why those of you who, I think most of you guys are part of our fan run Facebook group, The Gallery, which I'll plug because it's such a great group of people and the discussion there is so good because I think everyone is aligned there. They're like, we don't want BS, we want to have real intellectual discussion because we are smart enough to have those discussions. They make us better, they refine our minds, and the truth is what we're out here for. And I think in this case, truth was reached, as devastating as that is. But I have no qualms that the jury came back within 3 or 4 hours to find Alec Murdaugh guilty, because I do believe he is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt.
And it's one of the things Bob says all the time. I'm not just saying this because he's in the chat room, but because I've been hard on defense attorneys this whole time. But one of the things he says when he and I are talking is that our job is to educate people on reality and diffuse a lot of the BS that's out there. And I truly believe that because I think there is so much out there. And I was very concerned that this jury would either return a not guilty verdict or would hang, not because the evidence wasn't there, but because there is so much media, and true crime is one of the leading proponents of this, just misinformation about what evidence is and what reasonable doubt is. And it was so refreshing to see this jury just reject all of that and be like, what are you talking about? Of course he did it.
Way to go, people of South Carolina, by the way.
Yes,
like
100%.
Way to go.
and way to go, the people of that county. There were so many people who questioned whether or not, people asked, people now are like, oh, it's so unfair that the trial wasn't moved. The trial wasn't moved because the defense didn't want to move it. I think Alec Murdaugh in the back of his head thought, I own this place and these people will not convict me. And they did. And for all the people who criticized the people of that county and acted like they were a bunch of backwoods yokels, they weighed that evidence and they came to a verdict that really just stood in the face of the power dynamic in that place for 100 years.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you guys, this has been so fun. Thank you for joining us on such last minute. What are we, like 1,300 people, 1,200 people? That's an insane amount of people. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for sticking with us on so many Murdoch conversations. It's been really fun, Brett.
You got like 7 more to go, Alice. Don't stop yet. You got to listen to all the ones we've already recorded.
So. We have please listen to them because we recorded like crazy people, so that you guys would have episodes when I finally go to the hospital.
Yeah. And, as we're about to sign off, I want to give a shout out to all the people from Walker County. I don't know about y'all, but it's good to see you in the chat room.
Sorry, one last thing. One question that I remember. Some of you guys asked, was it okay that the media camera panned across the jury as they were leaving? So there's no ban on showing who the jurors are. They are free people. They can go give interviews now. I think kind of like how the paparazzi shouldn't take pictures of celebrities' kids. It's kind of along those lines where it's like they didn't ask for this fame. They didn't ask to be part of the most televised criminal trial of our day. And so leave them out of it. And so that they don't get harassed. But there's no actual ban on showing their faces because they can show their own faces. So that's not going to overturn the verdict because their faces were scanned. I think generally it's nice to not do that because they are just lay people who literally got subpoenaed to the court and were picked to serve on the jury, and they did not ask to be in the limelight. And if they want to be in the limelight, they can choose to do it.
And the judge kind of explained that to the jury right before it happened, that basically, up to this point, they couldn't show him. Up to this point, they were sort of banned from that, and they couldn't talk to him or anything. Now it was, basically kind of up to them. They can go talk to anybody they want to. So, it was one of those things that I don't think Law and Crime or whoever it was,
I can't remember who did it.
The pool person, I don't think they intended to do it, but it's not like that person's going to be thrown in jail for contempt or anything. It just sort of is what it is. And my understanding is they've already sort of edited that footage out. So it happened. You can see their faces. But like Alice said, at this point, they're public. And in fact, there's case law that says you can't keep them secret. That once the verdict is rendered, that's it. All those sort of secrecy things you had before are over. Now there's a public interest, First Amendment right of the press, to know exactly who was on the jury and to reach out to them if they want to. Obviously, the jury doesn't have to talk to them, but a lot of that secrecy, as soon as that verdict is rendered and they're released from service, all that just kind of goes away. So sort of an interesting thing. Just back to, since some people missed this, the motion for a directed verdict, you always do that. It doesn't mean anything. It's always denied. It's part of the appeal process. Happens in every single case. So that's just what you do. You always ask for that. And once in a blue moon, it's granted. Wasn't going to be granted in this case, but every now and then it is.
It has happened, and it is a bad feeling as a prosecution when it is, because you have messed up in some way, in like a really big way. So it absolutely can happen. You guys,
now, this probably is the last live we're going to do. I know we said that last time, but this time
it really is, because there's no more verdict. Like this is what we've hung on for. We're done now.
Yes.
I'm not dying. I will come back, but like probably no more lives.
Yes. So, and for those of you who continuously ask, when the baby is born and mama and the baby are safe, I will let you know that we have a baby. So you don't have to keep asking. We will let you know. It won't be a secret.
You guys are the best. You guys are truly the best. I think you guys are more excited than I am, which is fantastic. So thank you. All right. Well, let me sign us off and we'll stay on, of course. But Brett, before we sign off for this hour and a half long discussion of the verdict, do you have anything else you'd like to add?
No, Alice, just that there's no one else I would rather spend days and days and days on a case with than you.
Thanks, Brett. It goes the same with you. Well, until next time, I'm Al. Come on.
And I'm Bro.
And this is the Prosecutor's Legal Briefs. Come on, Brett, get yourself together.
I can't help it. I don't know why I didn't see it coming. I should have seen it coming.
This is not our last live forever. Just our last live until I go deliver this baby. So no, absolutely. We're going to keep doing lives. We actually love these lives because we love your comments. And I try to comment along or read the comments.
It's a lot of fun.
It's a lot of fun.
I like it too.
I like these probably better than just talking to you, Brett.
No, well, that's to be expected. Next time we'll have to have Bob on so he can actually talk.
I know. I don't know how to. I can't figure out electronics, Bob. I'm sorry. I would let you on, but I literally don't. I could barely get my microphone to work tonight. When I sent Brett into a tizzy.
Yeah, well, that was weird.
I think it was only you. I think nobody else heard it.
It was a very, very strange.
Well, you couldn't stop laughing, which was very.
Well, the thing was, wonderful. It was like I could hear you 5 seconds after you talked, and so.
Bob, can you click that link? Bob, can you? Let's email it to him.
Can you not click it?
I don't know.
Is he still with us? Did he leave?
I don't know. Bob, come back. I'm sorry, I can't figure this out.
Bob's like, I'm done with you people.
Oh, hey, there you are. Bob, can you click that link? You can come everyone clicks. I know everyone's gonna come in.
Well, the thing is, they can only come in if I let them in. So.
Oh, then you know.
Ah, ha, ha, ha.
Oh my goodness. Well, I'm gonna watch the sentencing tomorrow for sure. Actually, I want to go watch the rebuttal again. Someone asked if, even though the verdict came back, you should go listen to the closings. Yes, absolutely. Especially if you want to skip over 6 weeks of testimony and go straight to the closings. 6 hours of closings is a lot faster than 6 weeks of testimony. So I would recommend it. I thought it was, at least the prosecution's closing, a really good lesson in what a good closing is and how to be effective in doing it. So yes, I would go listen to it.
I sent you the link on Twitter as well. So no more excuses.
No more excuses. Get on here, Bob. We're not. Look, people. Oh, this is about. We should really just start recording a second one. Why not?
We can always split it up later.
Exactly.
Bob has a lot of comments.
Oh my gosh, Bobby, come on in. I'm
Bob, I don't want to talk to you. I'm using excuses.
That's okay. Well, you guys, I'm actually serious about this. Brett is like so tired. He took his sweet little toddler daughter skiing, which is like, I don't love my kids that much. We don't go skiing.
Whatever. It was amazing. She was so good. It was great.
She was good. She was a better
We had a great
skier than
time.
I am.
Yeah. Sorry I was away for all the ending of the trial.
You came back in the nick of time.
Isn't that the truth? That the truth?
Nick of time. This was fantastic.
Here I was, looking forward to going to bed early.
Not so much. Is it already 10? Oh my goodness, it's pretty late. Okay. Well, Bob, we'll have you back on. We promise. Brett does look tired.
We definitely will. We definitely will, Bob. We love you.
We love you, Bob. We love all of you guys. Thank you so much for just being such great commenters. I learned so much about the case from you guys on the gallery page.
All of you guys.
What's up?
Hi guys.
Welcome to the after show.
I'll just jump on and say
so much about the case from you guys.
I love you guys. All of you guys.
He's got his.
Hey.
Welcome to the after show.
Jump on and say
so much about the case from you
I love you guys. All of you guys.
He's got his.
Hey.
Welcome to the after show.
I think Bob needs to turn off his.
Oh wait. Yeah. Yeah, sorry.
There we
There you
go.
go.
No, I loved it. I loved
I have the YouTube still running. I'm old. I don't understand.
No, that was awesome. Welcome to the show, Bob Mata. So
Thank you,
wonderful
guys.
to have you back. We're just gonna start recording another show, y'all.
Yeah, there you go. What did you think, Bob? Were you surprised?
Are you like ready to pop like any second? Is that what's happening?
There's
Wow.
like an eviction date. There's like an eviction date.
Yeah, I think I was 2 weeks past due for my mother. Like at the time, a long time ago, I was like the heaviest baby that was ever born at this Westlake hospital. So yeah, I hope that happens for you sooner rather than later.
Thank you. Me too. But the race for the verdict won. What do you think about the Alec Murdaugh verdict?
I was surprised at the speed of it. I thought that, to me, it gave me relief, to be honest with you, because I was just sitting there. I'm like, the hardest thing for me to try to like grasp as a human being, like stripping away the lawyer part of it, was like that this guy could kill his own son. You know, it's just so hard. I can't compute it. It just will. No matter how hard I try, I cannot make it compute. It's just such a crazy thing for apparently like no reason. You know, it's like whether you buy the motive or you don't, and if it's true, it's a terrible reason to kill your kid. There's no viable excuse for doing that. So to me, it actually gave me great relief. It kind of took away like the trepidation, because I just kept sitting there. I'm like, man, if I was on this jury, I don't know what I'd do. Like, it's like everything adds up that it's him, but it's like I just can't.
You don't want to believe it because
I don't want to believe it.
Right?
It was like so hard for me to believe.
And that's Bob. That's so insightful, because this is tragic for everyone. Like, it's tragic for us as a society that this can happen. That this man, the evidence is overwhelming that he did this.
I mean,
like,
nothing
there
else.
exists this man. He did this.
Nothing else made sense. It's like,
So when do you think they lost the case?
I think ultimately, I think that it was the little detective's video was just an absolute gut shot that could never, I mean, when you couple it with the lie, it was, you could not, like, as soon as the jury heard that it was done, he was done. I didn't care what was said after it. I know, I kept talking about, the fact that the jurors didn't have notebooks, but the only thing they had to remember is that he was down at the kennels and he lied about it. At the end of the day, and Allison, and I agree with her, I think the fact that the clothes that he was wearing in the first video, that they vanished off the face of the earth, was pretty damning. I mean, because I was telling Allison, I'm like, man, the guy could have just gone and like gotten the same damn shirt. He had a year, he didn't even do that. It's like, that's how, confident he was in his, in all his narcissistic bullshit, BS. But I was like, man, so I think that those two factors alone for a jury, when you see that, and I have to be honest, I think that there's this probably overwhelming hatred of the Murdoch family in that county, just because they've been running it for 100 years. And, when people are in that kind of power, other people resent that, especially regular folk around that area. I have to be like, man, I'm like over the Murdochs running it, so when they started throwing in the 404B stuff, which everyone on that jury knew anyway, it's like, for us, Brett and Alice, it was like an amazing thing to watch in a trial like that, because it was like fascinating to see that battle and to have those offers of proof and all that stuff come on and happen. And all in the meantime, everyone in that county, in that town, knew exactly who they were. They knew what all the stories were. None of them were surprised by anything that they heard at trial in terms of the backstory. So for me, I just felt like, look, I think that even if they were hedging on guilt or innocence, or not even innocence, just that they weren't sure about whether or not he did it, everything else combined in terms of them being just tired of this guy was enough to have them. It was a super easy decision. They're like, this guy is beyond awful. And I'm like heavy leaning guilty anyway. So any thought of me being swayed the other way is garbage. Like, I'm not going to even contemplate it, so that's how I feel about it.
The last time that we talked, it was right before the prosecution rested. And so we hadn't talked about the defense. So as a defense attorney, I'd love to hear your thoughts on Alec Murdaugh taking the stand and how you've heard what we think about it and how it came off, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on him taking the stand and whether that, shot himself in the foot or made it, obviously didn't do him that good for favors.
No, look, I mean, you guys know as well as I do. I mean, I'm sure Jim and Poot tried to talk him out of it vehemently. Like, there's no way you can help yourself with this thing, man. Like, and he, which was probably par for the course, was the smartest guy in the room. And he's like, nah, man, I'm going to fix this. Don't worry about it. I'm going to get up there. I'm going to be able to explain it, blah, 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 blah. And Brett, like when you had tweeted, like, I had made that exact, like, that was the only way he could have approached it, exactly what you tweeted. And I had said that on Law and Crime the other day. I'm like, that is the only viable excuse, where he just comes and flat out just admits, look, man, I knew I was going to be the guy. I'm a former prosecutor. I know how this game is played. I'm the husband. I'm the father. I discovered the bodies. I was the last one to see him. I'm the suspect. I wasn't willing to give him anything else, so that's it. So I think that once he decided to do it, and then once he had married himself to this concept of, paranoia from the pills, and I didn't trust SLED, I'm like, he's done. I'm like that, because that was the only thing that I thought in my mind that he could help himself with, is if he could sell that to the jury to where they bought it, because like I had tweeted, what if I was Creighton Waters, what my final statement in the closing would have been, and what's the last guy's name? Mopser. Like, I call him the identical guy from My Cousin Vinny, because he reminded me so much of that dude. Man. Identical, like his canter, the way he looked. I was like, it's him. But he was great. Like, out of all the closings, I thought he was just super effective. I thought he was the guy who really drove it home. I thought he was the perfect offset for Griffin, because Griffin, like Poot he's not from there. You know, it's like he has that, you know, stuffed suit, you know, pompous defense lawyer thing about him. And I don't think that he would have resonated with the jury anyway. But like you guys said, that was done. Closings were an exercise of futility. They had all made up their minds long before closings. You know, they probably could have stopped the case right after they introduced the video and got the same exact verdict, you know?
Well, and somebody said in the chat that it's ironic that Paul solved his own murder. And I think that's true. I think my wife and I were talking about this. Without the video, I don't think he's convicted. Not necessarily. I mean, maybe he would be anyway. Without the video, yeah, maybe. Without the video, he doesn't testify, and there's no proof that he's at the scene. There's some circumstantial evidence, like, you know, the phone's off and like all the other stuff. But that was such a huge part of it. And without that video, I think he walks.
Those guys who they think picked up the hose. That's what still keeps me.
Yeah, the hose. I mean, the hose ended up being a red herring, right? Because like when he testified, it was like, oh, but like when you listen to the video, you can hear either Paul or Maggie was using the hose. So like how it got put up ended up not being a thing, or at least that's the way I construed it. Like when I saw the video, like for the first time, and I could actually hear, because when they first played it, I could not hear a word that anybody was saying, and everyone was just like, "That's Alex." But by the end of the trial, the sound was very clear to me, and I know that I heard the hose being sprayed. So that to me became kind of a non-factor. But
Alex pick a hose up that's already on the ground.
Okay, he's guilty. Relax, calm down.
So, Bob, I'm curious. What would you have done with? I agree. The video was incredibly. I mean, it was the silver bullet, right? What would you have done with that piece of evidence as the defense attorney?
Man, like I think the only thing that you could have done was like it because you can't look at the video without combining it with the lie. You know, they became so intertwined that. You know, and obviously his attorneys knew going in that was a major problem. You know, they knew in terms of going into that case, the one thing we're going to have to deal with, our biggest weakness, the strongest piece of evidence they have, is that they have you down at the kennels and you lied about it. So how do we deal with it? And the only way that I could think to deal with it is to get the jury to the place where they can understand where a person in that position. And it was tough with Murdoch because he had lied so much about everything that it becomes like the impossible task. It's like, you know, like you have to be Hercules in order to get, you know, people to move mountains in order to get people to believe that he's not lying about that one thing. And when he's lied about everything else for the last 20 years, and it's like you've got, you know, but like the reality is like if I walked home, God forbid, and my wife and my kids were killed, and I was the last one to see them, and I'm the one who's calling it in, I know I am the suspect. And if I had something like man, do I put myself, you know, within 5 minutes of the murders or don't I, if I don't know that I'm going to get caught about it? I mean, I might lie about it just out of self-preservation, not me per se, but just in general. You know, I think that might be a human response. But, you know, getting over the mountain of lies for decades is impossible. You know, I mean, the guy was just an awful human being. He
was, and that hurt him, right? But the thing that surprised me, Bob, and you heard our discussion of this, but to me, there are 2 points that I would have made. Number one is the one you just made, and we talked about this, that say that, look, I knew I'd be the main suspect, and the only thing that mattered to me was finding out who killed my wife and son, and I wasn't going to give SLED another reason to think it was me. So I lied about that. I wanted them to go out and find out who did it, not focus on me, and that was a mistake, and I shouldn't have done that. That'd have been the first thing. The second thing, and what was weird about this, is for like 30 seconds in the closing, this point was made by Jim, and that's if you want to see how Murdoch feels about his family, look at the fact that he tried to kill himself to help out Buster. I would have combined those two and sort of made that my argument. I mean, look, maybe it was just
because your one little twist there at the end is key to that selling the lie, where I really want them to be able to figure out who killed my family. So I didn't want me to become the fixture. I didn't want them to tunnel vision onto me. That's a crucial part of it that had to have been said, you know.
And then the defense can say, and guess what they did? they tunnel visioned on him. He was 100% right.
Exactly.
But then that explains the mountain of evidence. Of course, there's a mountain of evidence when you haven't dug anywhere else. You didn't take DNA off their clothes. You didn't go here. You didn't go there. You didn't go to all the places that other mountains of evidence existed because you were tunnel visioned on me. And I know this because I'm a lawyer. I get it. I've tried criminal cases. I wanted you to find the killer and you haven't. And now he's out there somewhere. And I'll sit here all day long to find justice for my sweet Paw Mags. I mean, that's how you do it, right? But and I, you're going to be our defense attorney of the year,
right?
What happened with closing? What happened? What do you think happened? Not the actual argument. What do you think happened behind the scenes before Griffin kind of choked? And then I'd also like to hear how you would have argued it.
I think that. Obviously there had to have been a massive conversation between Poot and Griff and Murdoch in terms of like, okay, who's doing this? And I think fundamentally, like throughout the course of the trial, I personally liked Griffin's style better for where they were trying the case in terms of, I thought he was just more relatable to the jury. He just came off, he's a little more homespun. He's from the area. I think that the jury would relate to him, whereas Poot is not that guy. He's the snarky, making offhand comments guy, getting an occasional laugh, but just blustered, so I think ultimately they landed on Jim. And, I think that, I agreed. I was on early enough, Alice, to where I heard you kind of saying, he just was all over the map. He should have picked a lane and said, okay, look, this is what I'm going to do. This is what we're going to say. If you're, like you said, if I'm going to attack the police work, that's what I'm going to stick with the whole way. Yes, I'll mention the other things, but in terms of, kind of just checking off things okay, so they said this is how we rebut it. Check. You said this is how we're going to rebut it. And that was what, and it just came off very haphazard to me. In the beginning, I thought that he was doing a nice job. And then ultimately, by the end of it, I just, because I was live tweeting. And so I was seeing the reaction of people that weren't me, who were lay people that weren't an attorney. Because we always look at stuff through the viewfinders of attorneys. We can't turn that off. It's just built into us, so I always look at it like that. So, but the more I kept reading, and people were just like, I can't stand Jim. He's stuttering and saying and stammering, and I can't stand it, and I can't even I can't listen to it. And I was and he's going so slowly. I started to realize, I'm all right, I have to kind of look at it from a different perspective, because I thought, at least in the first half hour, that he was hitting some high notes. I thought that he was doing a pretty decent job, and the longer it went on, the more I started to kind of see the point of view of the people, and the people are the people who represent the jury. That's the way I kept putting it on Twitter. I'm look, anything in this thread that we have going on Twitter, this is representative of the jury. We all observe things differently. We all perceive things differently. We all have our own life experiences, and that's how we all look at it. None of us look at something the same way, and we can have the exact same facts, and all three of us could look at it in a slightly different way. You know what I mean? So at that point, so my thing would have been, I would have had to really, I would have worked on the lie the entire closing. That would have been the entire focus of my closing, trying to offset that lie, trying to get them to somehow believe that this one time he's telling the truth, that he laid on his sword. He basically came in and gave an in-court confession to every financial crime that he is guilty of. And he did that for one reason and one reason only. And that was because he will go down for something that he did, and he'll take his medicine, but he's not going to go down for killing his wife and his son. I think he would have had to, I would have leaned into that hard, because to me, there was no other argument. The semantics of it all, whether the brain came out of the bottom or, where the child was dude, I'm none of this makes any difference. It makes no difference on how they were So yeah, to me, the only thing that would have made any difference potentially, in light of the speed of the verdict, I don't know that would have made a difference anyway. But it would have been to just kind of really, really focus on the fact that this one time he didn't lie, that he didn't do this. But just, man, the timing of it was so hard, and like the only other thing I would have done, it's equally challenging to kind of try to figure out how he cleaned up so thoroughly. Because, really, if I'm the prosecution, I would have said, well, they want to say that Sled was a little sloppy with this, but, that really worked in favor of Alec Murdaugh because he may not have cleaned up all that well because he only had 4 to 5, 6 minutes to clean up. You know what I'm saying? So it's like, I think no matter which way they would have handled it, the prosecution would have had a pretty good parry for it, So I don't know. It was a tough case. I just know I've tried cases like that, and it's exhausting for everybody. It's like the amount of work that was put in by both teams is just monumental and exhausting,
Let me ask you this, psychologically.
Baby tonight, man.
Yeah, you will. Psychologically.
They're still working, though, because they have a sentencing tomorrow.
Well, there's not much to say.
He's not going to have to do too much work. That's going to be basically them trying to mitigate, but I don't know. He's getting, like Brett said, he's getting 2 lives. That's it, period.
You think that the defense's position, and don't let me put words in your mouth, this isn't true, that Poot and Jim would have told him, do not testify?
100%.
And given that fact, what happens to you as a defense attorney when you've built up this entire case and you have a strategy and your client blows it all up on you because he insists on doing something like taking the stand? I know that you have to continue to work vigorously for him and all this other stuff, but psychologically, I mean, does that,
of course,
you feel that
it takes the wind out of your sails, man? It's like everything that you've put together, and it's always like a game time decision whether or not somebody's going to testify. It's like, in terms of the defendant, it's always like, all right, let's see how their case in chief goes. Okay. Like we won't make the decision whether or not you're going to testify until the state's case in chief is over. And if they made a lot of headway and we feel like it's mandatory, then, maybe we'll talk about putting you on. And then it becomes, okay, how do we mitigate you being on the stand for potentially 2 days and not getting completely destroyed? Because look, there was never any point that I believe that Alec Murdaugh, because if they put him on and they knew that he did it, then they were suborning perjury. So I'm going to assume that they did not know, that he did not tell them, look, I did this, you got to help me get out of it. So let's assume that Jim and Poot didn't know. And so they're saying, all right, so we got to try to figure this out, and I'm assuming that they prepped him as much as they could with him being detained, but it's not going to be like the way you would want it in a perfect world and being able to, prep him. And, he was counting on his charm. I mean, there's one thing that you can say about the guy is the guy's a master manipulator. Like he was an unbelievable manipulator. And like, there were parts of the testimony where I was actually feeling emotional. Like I was buying what he was selling, knowing that he's just a habitual liar. So it's like that was kind of his superpower. And I really credit the jury for being able to overlook that and not buy into it because, the guy, like you can see how the guy settled cases for more, over value on all these PI cases. Like he was talking about how he justified, well, I asked my partner what he thought the case was worth. He said $100,000 and I got 400. So, well, I figured I made the extra 3. Why not steal it? It's like that's like his ability to be able to do that. Like, I don't think the guy was a great trial lawyer. I think he was a great schmoozer. I think that he could just talk, and I think that he was engaging in that way. Like he just scary like that, So I just think that ultimately at the end of the day, like you have to give all the credit to the jury in terms of being able to, whether it was a combination of like, they were more than ready to end the Murdaugh reign of terror in that county for the last 100 years. And that played a part in it, which I'm sure it did, even if it was subconsciously, even if they're like, I feel like he did it, but they didn't exactly prove it beyond reasonable doubt, but it's super close to that. And the rest of it just makes it to the point where I feel very comfortable with calling him guilty. Because at the end of the day, he's doing just as much time on those the financial charges. I had read somewhere that like, if there were 3 particular charges that he was looking at life for 3 of them. And when he gets in front of a federal judge that they abhor attorneys stealing from their clients more than anything on the planet, man. Like
that was a lot of charges stacked up. But
yeah, and then the judge was going to hammer them with whatever the max sentence would be in the, because it would have been a long time. So it was kind of like, let's
Bob,
put
you've talked about the psychological effect, that it would have on you as a person. I think people would love to hear this because we're getting to get inside, the defense attorney's mind. And a lot of people have asked, did Poot and did Griffin know that he did it? Even if they didn't ask him specifically and there wasn't the explicit, I did it. As the testimony is coming out, the evidence is getting pretty clear. Have you been in that situation where, you're defending someone who's absolutely done something heinous? How does that affect you psychologically? And how do you do your job effectively? Because I've heard some people say like, oh, he threw the closing because he knew that his client was guilty. Lawyers don't do that, right? Lawyers don't do that. I don't think defense attorneys do that. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on what that's like when you sign up to be a defense attorney. A lot of your clients are going to be guilty. That is just kind of the name of the game. And you sign up on that job knowing that. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how you deal with that, how that affects you, and what goes through your mind as you're, offering your vigorous defense, because everyone deserves it.
Right. So luckily for me, I was well armed to answer that question, like going into being an attorney just by way of my father representing John Wayne Gacy. So as you can imagine, he got that question. That was the number one question I always asked of him. Like, not was he a creep? How could you defend him? Like how morally, how did you check your morals at the door and be able to go in and do the job? And my dad's answer was simple, and I adopted it. And he defends the principles of the Constitution. He does not focus on the client. He focuses on the principles of the Constitution. He looks at the case. If there's motions to suppress or motions to quash that need to be filed early on in the case, that's what he does. He makes sure his job becomes to, at that point, once you move past the motion phase, you're then concerned with making sure that you're putting on the best defense that you can. It's like you're always able to find an avenue in terms of defending these people where, you're able to look yourself in the mirror. You know what I'm saying? It's like you're not having to sell your soul to the devil, because look, you guys know you're in the business. Most of the times the cops get it right, and if they've done the job right in terms of collecting the evidence, and they're going to survive motions early on and their evidence is going to make it in. Conviction rates are in the mid 90s for a reason. You know what I mean? It's like in the true crime world, it seems like we're constantly hearing about wrongful convictions and things of that nature, but they're not as frequent as everyone thinks. Typically they got the right guy, and typically they get convicted. Those are kind of just facts. So it's like I was telling Brett, I think Alice, before, the time that we all were together, the reality is that you want competent counsel on both sides so that victims' families don't have to go through the nightmare of a trial again because you had some schmuck on the defense that was just mailing it in. You know what I mean? So it's like you want everybody doing a good job on both sides of it. That way, justice is done properly one time. It's going to survive appeals, and it's not going to get kicked back for a retrial. So, it's like you just.
Let me ask you this, Bob.
Yeah.
There's a wrinkle in this. We mentioned it earlier. I don't know if you were in when we talked about this. So Jim, he's not just representing some random person, and he's not even just representing his friend.
Right.
He's representing his friend for killing his son, who Jim represented before and knew well, called him his friend in closing.
Right.
Is there, I don't want to call it like a conflict, but that is different. I don't know that I've ever seen that before. What do you think about that?
I wouldn't have touched that with a 10-foot pole. Like I would not have. I agree. I was curious about that relationship because, going into it, I wasn't sure. I didn't know if Harpootlian was from down around there. I didn't know. You know what I mean? And then it became clear to me very quickly that Griffin was in that area, that he was an attorney down there, that he was a friend of the family. That so I didn't know that going in, and as that became more and more apparent. I had just tweeted today, I'm like, the worst thing that you can do in the world as an attorney is represent your family or your friends. It's like, how it is, especially from the defense side of it. you never do it right. They're never happy with you, no matter what. If you get I get a NG on a case, they're still mad about something, so they're never happy. And if it's your family or your friends, it's even worse. And then you have that internal conflict where you have this close relationship with somebody, which certainly would cloud your ability to be able to act as a professional in some sense. I mean, it's like where I would make a decision one way with a client that I had no relationship with in terms of being, just his attorney, where I have a personal relationship. It may sway me to do something that I wouldn't otherwise do, or I would advise against, just because that person's like, man, you got to do this for me. You know what I mean? So
about the relationship with Paul.
Who?
That's what they're asking.
No, it's Paul and Alec. I have the impression, I'm under the impression that he knew Alec pretty well too. I think I think that he went to, Alex went to Jim and said, man, I need you to help me with Paul. I'm sure that's how it went, and I'm sure that they were friends. It's a small area, and it's like all the attorneys.
I think Jim knew Paul his whole life. Because they were so close.
Exactly.
That's why he was so emotional in the closing, because he literally knew this kid since he was born.
It was the most powerful part of his closing when he talked about Paul.
Without quite like that one little voice crack at the end, man, was like the most powerful part of the entire closing. That's the only part that got to me. You know what I mean? Like right when I heard that crack, I'm like, oh man, and I felt myself whine, but I'm a softie. So I'm an easy crier. So, no, man, I think that it was a bad choice in terms of, because of that. I think that it probably and I think that if Jim was closing for somebody that he didn't know, that it would have come off more. I think he felt a different type of pressure because of that relationship.
Yeah.
It's just like you have to, because we're humans. We're all human beings. It's like people always we're not robots. We're all human beings. We all have feelings. We all bring that into our jobs, and we bring that out, and we care about what we're doing. And when it's highly personal for you, it's almost like defending yourself. You know what I mean? And which is the worst thing that you can do. It's the old the lawyer who represents himself as a fool for a client thing. So it's kind of that same thing. You know what I mean? So I don't know, man. To be honest, I don't think any lawyer could have gotten him off that. I think it played out the way it was supposed to play out. I think that the little detective's video, man, was kid solved it.
And that's just so sad. It just reminds me of the Delphi case. We've all wanted justice for so long in the Delphi case, and one of the victims caught video, right? That hopefully will nail the perpetrator. But that's what happened here, and it's just so sad on so many levels, and
it's awful.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that back around, because I know there's a lot of just crap said about Paul, and there's documentaries talking about, but no, not a single person deserves to be shot.
No, and you know what? And I get the sense of who probably Paul was, in terms of pulling that, it's my boat thing. I could see him being that guy, but he's an 18, 19-year-old kid. I don't think he was a fundamentally bad human being. I mean, he certainly is the spawn of Alec, though.
He's a product of where he came from, right?
Exactly.
He wasn't born that
privilege and of massive privilege. It's like that whole thing. You grow up in privilege like that, where you think that you're untouchable. It's like reality can be an awfully brutal slap in the face. And, that family just got it massively, and like you said, though, with Paul, though, no matter what he did in terms of, kind of being a turd with his friends and just being that guy, the people who seemed to care about him and loved him seemed like he was a genuinely good kid. And, there's nothing excuses for what happened to him. You know what I mean? Under any circumstances, that there's nothing that makes that okay. And for Maggie either.
What about Buster? I mean, you being the defense attorney, you get to know the family a lot better. Buster has obviously testified for the defense about how much he loves his father. He sat behind his dad. For me, just as a parent, when when the guilty verdict was read, we've been in the courtroom for a lot of guilty verdicts that are read, and there's usually crying, very visceral crying from the family members in the background. It was silent. And what broke my heart was that, like, Alec never even looked back at Buster. I mean, he may have been too embarrassed, but what do you think is going through Buster's head?
He mouthed "I loved you" to Buster as he was getting brought through the door. It's okay, I love you. So either way though, man, that kid.
I feel for Buster. I really do. I mean, he's lost his whole family.
Everybody. I mean, aside from John Marvin, who really, I'm sure John Marvin's going to be his rock for the foreseeable future. I mean, for as much as I detested Alec, I kind of actually liked John Marvin. I thought, it's like you never know how much of it's a sham, in terms of him being prepped but he came off like a very likable guy, but that may run in the family, that ability to be able to kind of woo people with their, their Southern charm and, that kind of like down to earth, like personality that they seem to have. And yeah, man, that kid is like, when you think about his life, because it's not just like moving forward. It's like everything that they had has now been stripped away, aside from the legacy and, the money, just everything. Like his life, for wherever he lives, people will always be looking and pointing and saying, man, there's the kid. Like, I don't care if he's in what state he's in. The kid's he's a huge ginger. He's like, to see him, he's completely noticeable, So it's like I feel terrible for him. It's devastating. I mean, I couldn't even imagine what that would be like, like it's impossible for me to imagine that kind of trauma. And just like devastated, like he literally lost his entire family, like in the blink of an eye, in a period of like 3.5, 4 years. It's like
the worst possible way, brutal murders, and like the most public trial of all time.
Like right. He loses his sister or his brother and his mother in that way, and then has to sit through this trial where his father is just made out to be the monster that he is for the world to see. It's like, man, the question I had, I'm like, all right, so if they're going to do victim statements tomorrow, is Buster going to get up there? And if you're Buster, what do you do? I had somebody tweeting me, Brett, like kind of when we were tweeting back and forth in there, when you jumped in, and she was like, well, because I had said, well, I think that there's a slight possibility that Buster may at this point say, you know what, Dad? That time when I just came up there and testified on your behalf, that was the last thing that I was doing for you, and then like maybe he goes up there and just maybe it's cathartic for him to just go out and just lay into him and say, you broke my heart. I can't believe, you know what I mean? As opposed to asking the judge for mercy, which he's not going to give him anyway. If I was counseling Buster, I'd say, you know what, man, go up there and speak with your heart, whatever that may be. I mean, it's like, because that's the only way you're going to heal it all, and if that's saying, Dad, you're horrible. You destroyed me. Like, I can't tell you that how much you've destroyed me. You've destroyed my life. You've destroyed our family, just lay it out for him like that, because that's the truth. And you know what? That guy needs to hear it from the kid, the only living member of his family left. He needs to hear it from him. I'd love to see Buster get up there and give it to him like that, because like that guy needs to sit and stew on that for a long time, for as long as he can, because that's punishment.
Yeah. Well, you've heard it, everybody. You've chanted for Bob. He's come on and he's given his prediction of what's going to happen in 10 hours because we've now been on for 2.5 hours, and I'm afraid Brett might keel over if we don't let him go sleep.
Thank you for having me on. I appreciate you both.
No, Bob, it's always so great to hear your perspective, and I've loved your coverage on Long Crime. You're one of the few I can listen to. But
fortunately, they do not tell me that I have any kind of an agenda, which is good, because I'd have a problem with that, because I'm like you guys. I try to give the straight dope, like I'm not big on like no one's going to tell me what to say. Otherwise,
you do. That's why everybody
Right.
likes you so much.
Yeah.
Well,
and you guys were
I'll
cool.
just be the counter because you always have to have like a devil's advocate. Okay, so Bob is probably going to be right, but you've heard his prediction for tomorrow. I predict actually that Buster will give kind of the same milquetoast thing that he did for the defense, which is like, I love my dad. I've lost my mom and my brother. I have no one left in the world. Please don't make me lose my dad now. And it kind of stop there. Like I don't think it's going to go overboard. I think it's going to be pretty milquetoast because, in all honesty,
he doesn't talk.
Or there you go. Okay, so you have three options of what's going to happen tomorrow.
That's the other option. I actually agree with you, Alice. I think that's what's going to happen. What I want to see happen is what I said. Like that's what I
agree. For his therapy, I'd like him to say that. Yes. But I think that he's still a Murdaugh, and there's still a lot.
I agree.
And he probably is not free to say that, even if that's what he wants, because I think that this verdict is unfortunately not a surprise to either Alec or to Buster, or the rest of the family.
And like we all think, there's probably still money out there somewhere, and he's going to need it.
Yeah, absolutely. Anyways, so Bob, thank you for joining us. You finally gave the people what they wanted, and Allison, it's good to hear from you too, even if we didn't get to see you.
Alice, I wish you all the luck. I hope your baby is healthy and happy, and I hope everything goes well during the birth. So
thank you for those who are joining the chat like 5 weeks late. No, the baby's still inside. Thank you, Bob. I really appreciate it. Thanks for keeping Brett company when I may or may not be around. But we love you guys. Thank you. 1,000 of you have stayed on to listen to Bob because we love Bob. And until next time, Bob, you get to sign off too. I'm Al.
I'm Bob. Oh.
And I'm Bro.
See y'all.
And this is the Prosecutor's Legal Briefs. Thank you guys for humoring me. I love you guys.
See you guys. Bye.
See you later.
Good night.
Bye.
Bye.